Okay. So we'll pick it up in section 8. So nothing super exciting about section 8. It just talks about third party compensation. Obviously, RESPA and all these other things limit our compensation that we can receive and who we can receive it from. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing here. I'll tell you a story real quick. So if you guys don't know the whole Brett Lampier saga, he was a former broker here, left the Loveland office before I became the employing broker. But anyway, he was doing some development deals, kind of doing some underhanded stuff as part of that transaction. And so he's getting sued by numerous different people in various different counties and all this other stuff. And so anyway, as part of that lawsuit and, as part of the discovery, the bank records were subpoenaed for his development company that he had started. And one of the things that came to light as those banking records were being exposed is that there were brokers on the buyer side of these deals that Brett was selling these condos for. And they were effectively taking compensation from his development company that was not really commission. It was not part of the contract, right? And so it was like, hey, bring me an investor, bring me a buyer, and I'll pay you thousands of dollars under the table. That was not disclosed anywhere. It was not documented anywhere. And so now there's buyers brokers on the other side of the deal who, they were well-intentioned and, all this other stuff. And now they're facing like real estate commission violations and having their licenses taken away because they were taking non-disclosed compensation from a developer, for bringing investors into this development deal. So not a good idea. You guys don't ever want to take money under the table, take money outside of closing, right? It's one thing if your client buys you a, $50 gift card to, your favorite restaurant or something, like nobody's going to make a fuss about that. But when there's thousands of dollars under the table being paid as, a bonus or a commission or something like that, that's all bad. If there is a bonus, you are more than welcome to take it as long as it's all disclosed, as long as it's all above board, everybody knows about it, it's on the settlement statements, then no harm, no foul. But taking money under the table as compensation is not okay. So just make sure you know that, make sure you're aware of that. Bottom line, just don't take third-party compensation from anyone that, don't take it unless it's fully disclosed. Okay.
Hey, Jesse, there seems to be a little bit of a glare. I don't know if it's the gray hair or if it's just the lighting.
I think that's your gray hair reflecting back into your glasses, man. Oh, man. All right. Section 9. Section 9 talks about marketing. So, just a seller, we've advised the seller of the advantages and disadvantages of whatever various marketing methods there might be out there, including the use of the MLS. And so off-market listings have become a popular thing, right? And in many cases, the reason that brokers are trying to do these off-market deals is to put together the deal and take both ends of the deal and earn double the commission. And if that's the purpose for the off-market listings, then that's in violation of real estate commission rules. And now it's in violation of NAR's clear cooperation policy. So you got to be, bottom line is you can't do them, right? If you're going to market it to the public, then you have to have it in the MLS within 1 business day. And so part of the problem in the way that brokers are getting caught is what they're doing is they'll say, hey, they'll put it in as a coming soon listing, which, per NAR's clear cooperation policy, coming soon, that's okay, right? If you do some marketing and then within 1 business day, you put it in the MLS as a coming soon listing, that meets the threshold for, cooperating with NAR's clear cooperation policy. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, hey, we're going to do this. We'll list it on Tuesday, no showings until Friday, right? And then, some random buyer's broker will call them up and say, hey, any chance we can get into this thing on Wednesday because my client's in from out of town and, you know, they leave on Thursday, which just so you guys know, 90% of the time when you hear that, it's a lie and they're going to show up at your first showing anyway on Friday. So don't fall for it. But, you know, they'll call and they'll say, hey, can we get on Wednesday? And the listing broker will say, nope, sorry, no showings until Friday. That's when our showings start. So then the buyer's broker will have their client call you, the listing broker, pretend like they're not working with anyone and say, hey, Harry, any chance you can show us this property tomorrow, Wednesday, right? And you're like, oh, great, here's an unrepresented buyer. I have an opportunity to double end this deal. You're like, yep, that's perfect. Let's go show the property. Well, now you've declined a showing to a cooperating buyer's broker, and you're going to go show it to, you know, their client, right? If you're not willing to show it, to let a buyer's broker show it, you shouldn't be showing it either. And if you are, then it's a dead giveaway that your intent is to try to double end the deal. And the only reason to double end, you know, to do it that way is to line your own pockets at your client's expense by limiting the pool of prospective buyers that might be interested in purchasing their property. So don't do it. It's not a good idea. The MLS rules state that we can't allow showing. So, during the coming soon period. So even if you're, ready to go on Thursday, then you need to change it to active status instead of waiting until Friday, right? If you're going to start showing the property yourself or allow someone else to do it, then pop it in the MLS as an active showing, switch it earlier than you anticipated, get all that signed in writing by the seller, make sure that everyone's okay with that, and then no harm, no foul. But just trying to double end the deal to line your own pockets at your seller's expense, that'll get your license taken away real fast, okay? So need to advise them about, various marketing methods, including the MLS. Supposed to advise them about using different type of lock boxes, appointments, all these other things, right? And whether some of those methods might limit the ability of another broker to show the property. Because again, theoretically, most sellers are going to want the maximum exposure to market their property to the greatest number of buyers, right? And then after you've advised them, then the seller has chosen the following. Well, do they want the property submitted to one or more MLS? Probably yes, they will. That's, again, now with our clear cooperation policy, we really don't have an option. The only exception is we can market a listing within our own brokerage firm. Now, I know we have multiple KW offices on this call and maybe some guests as well. But even if we're just talking about Keller Williams and the 4 different offices that we have on this call, right? Even though we all fall under the umbrella of Keller Williams, we are all technically separate brokerages. And so even sharing the listing within this type of a setting or on a group Facebook page with multiple offices on it, that would trigger the NAR's clear cooperation policy to list the property in the MLS within 1 business day. Okay. So you would need to go to a private office page or, certainly an office meeting if you're not working with multiple offices in that office meeting or whatever. You could market the property that way. You could blast it out to all the brokers in your office and not have to put it into the MLS within 1 business day, but that's really the only exception. So you're effectively going to have to check this box. If for some reason you feel like you have a scenario where this is not going to be the case, then come talk to myself or your employing broker, and we'll see if there's a valid reason there. And just so you know, there are probably some valid reasons why you may not want to submit it to the MLS, but probably we're going to have to get attorneys involved so that we make sure we steer clear of any violations of NAR's policies. Okay. And then does the seller want the listing to be submitted to one or more information exchanges? So property information exchanges are going to be like Color Property, Homes.com, Zillow, right? Those types of things. And again, in most cases, yes, you want it to be marketed to those property information exchanges because again, that's going to help you market the property to the greatest number of buyers possible, right? Again, there may be some valid reasons why you don't. perfect example. We had a broker in the Fort Collins office who the seller was a gal who had just gone through a very brutal divorce. There was domestic violence involved. There was stalking, emotional trauma, just all sorts of bad stuff, right? And so the lady did not want her ex, who was effectively stalking her, to know that the property was for sale. And so it was not allowed to be publicly marketed. And this was before the clear cooperation policy, and she didn't even want it submitted to the MLS. She didn't want a yard sign. She didn't want a lockbox on the door. And so it just makes it very difficult to sell a property under those circumstances. And in her case, she knew that it was going to significantly cut back on the buyer pool and that she was going to take a hit financially. And that's in my opinion, a valid reason not to blast it out all over the internet, right? So if you have something unique, then come talk to us, let us know. We'll make sure you steer clear of any violations. Otherwise, just assume you're going to have to at least submit it to the MLS. Maybe there's a reason why you don't submit it, to every property exchange out there, but in most cases, that's just what you're going to do, okay? 9.1.2, seller authorizes the use of any electronic and any other marketing methods except, and in most cases, you're just going to leave this blank, unless the seller just doesn't want you to do a particular type of marketing for some reason. You might as well just leave it blank and use whatever type of marketing you have at your disposal that is agreed upon between you and the seller. Seller further authorizes the use of the data by the MLS and the property information exchanges, right? And that's just saying, hey, yes, you can use the information about my property to display in the MLS, to display on the internet. There's actually a new section in our contract that talks about removing that stuff, which I think we'll get to here shortly. Property address and property listing, in most cases, yes, they will be displayed on the internet. Again, you might have some cases where it really doesn't make sense to do that, but in almost every case, yes, you are going to check the will boxes and you're just going to display everything on the internet. Property access. So broker may access the property by whatever means you put here, right? Electronic lockbox, a manual lockbox. They might have an electronic keypad. The sellers might be present for the showings, which is always a little bit awkward, but that's a real thing, especially with tenant occupied properties, right? In many cases, the tenants are there and they either feel like they don't have to leave or they just don't know that they're supposed to leave. So in many cases, the tenants will be there and they'll just let you in. So talk to the seller about whatever method you're going to allow access to the property. There is nothing that's fail safe. The people like to, tout the advantages of an electronic lockbox, like a central lock. They're not fail proof. And probably the biggest issue that they have is when the batteries fail on them, then it's like very difficult to get them open. We have a broker who actually carries extra lockbox batteries in his car so that if he shows up to someone else's listing and their lockbox is dead, he'll open it up and replace the battery. And so that way he doesn't look like the idiot who can't get into the listing. So, know that there's downfalls to any of these options that you're going to use. Okay. 9.2.2, this is a newer section of our contract, and it's basically just asking, who are you authorized to allow access to the property? Well, in most cases, you're going to allow actively licensed real estate brokers to show the property, right? Typically, you're going to allow a licensed appraiser. You may have a cash deal or something, but you're not typically going to know that right up front. There are no licensed home inspectors in the state of Colorado. Home inspectors can get various different types of certifications and all that other stuff, but the state does not regulate and license home inspectors like they do real estate brokers and appraisers. So assuming you're going to allow an inspection, you're going to need to check that box. This is the big, more of a hot topic, and this is kind of why they added this section. There are many of the bigger brokers out there who they have unlicensed showing assistants to help show properties for them and whatever. So do you want to allow an unlicensed broker assistant into the property to show it? again, there's pros and cons to doing this, and we need to advise our client as to the pros and cons, right? And the benefit is that you have a potential buyer out there who wants to see the property that may not be able to see it otherwise. Excuse me. If you want to allow them, then that's okay. But just know that if they're unlicensed, then they're not subject to license law. They're not subject to the code of ethics that realtors follow, right? They are still subject to all of the normal, civil laws that you and I are subject to. It doesn't mean that they can go in and steal crap from the house with impunity. They're still, they're still liable for that stuff, but they're not subject to a code of ethics. They're probably not subject to anything regarding license law because they're not licensed. Okay. So in most cases, I check this box personally because I want to expose the property to, the maximum amount of buyers. If the seller's not comfortable with that, totally okay. There is no right or wrong here. It's just explain the pros and cons and let you and the client, figure out what works best.
Hey, Jesse.
Yep.
What are some of the ethics and different licensing laws that would be disadvantageous that we follow, that this unlicensed broker that would come in or assistant would come in that wouldn't have to follow, but that would be disadvantageous for our client?
Well, I mean, any law relating to license law would not, I mean, they're just not subject to anything, right? I mean, and my opinion, right, is that there's really nothing that would be so disadvantageous that it would, make me second guess allowing one of these people into the house, right? I mean, probably the biggest thing is they haven't been background checked, right? Whereas the real estate commission does a background check. And so doesn't mean that all realtors are good people and that, realtors may not steal from the property too, because that's a real thing. And that's happened before where there was someone who literally just got disciplined last year for going into a house after their client left. They ended up stealing medication from a box that had been packed up in the garage, and the seller ended up finding out about it. So, it's not fail safe, but there's been no background check on these people, right? And then as far as code of ethics, the code of ethics has numerous different pieces that we as realtors have to subscribe to, right? And there's duties to the public, there's duties to other brokers, there's duties to, each other, right? So, it's just ethical behavior, right? And they could go in there and they could totally, trash other agents while they're in there. And again, does that happen with regular realtors? Yeah, it probably does, more than anyone wants to admit. So again, I don't think there's anything so advantageous, in my opinion, that I would want to limit those people showing the property. But really, it's up to the sellers. But I think the biggest piece is that they haven't probably been background checked by anybody, whereas licensed agents have, right?
So Jesse, in the other category, would you put like a staging person or your virtuants, let's say, or whoever's going to take your photographs? Would you put that there or?
Yes. So you could definitely put any of your vendors that you're going to use, right? Or, potentially other not home inspectors as we think of them, but other inspector type people, right? Someone doing a sewer scope, somebody doing a mold test, whatever. That being said, I don't typically write stuff in there. I make sure that I'm communicating with my clients via text or email. Hey, photographer is going to be there at this date, this time, right? And they're like, okay, that works for us. Okay, I've got it in writing then. I don't need to put that in my agreement, but it certainly doesn't hurt either. Okay.
Jesse, does our office have an unlicensed assistant to do showing? Or
not so
not
we are developing some additional resources, so we don't at this moment, but there are some teams that have their own unlicensed assistants, and every now and then those unlicensed assistants do show property. I have used an unlicensed assistant to show a property while I was on vacation before. So it does come up from time to time. If you run into that type of a situation, obviously that unlicensed person is probably not going to have access to showing time or whatever other than through your account. And so if you're going to allow them to schedule through your account, but they're going to show the property, you need to disclose that, hey, like, just so you know, this is going to be my unlicensed assistant showing the property. Is that okay? And get permission before you just give the combo to somebody. Because if you give the combo to an unlicensed person who's not authorized to enter a property, then almost automatic $500 fine if you get caught for the first offense, and then additional penalties and fines and stuff on top of that. So not a good idea to give a lockbox to somebody who's not authorized to have it. So make sure you're disclosing that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Let's see. As far as broker marketing, so 9.3.1 asks for specific marketing tasks that you as the broker are going to do. I had somebody ask me, well, what do you put in 9.3.1? And the answer is, it depends, right? If it's a close friend or family member who, like, they're going to sign the listing with me regardless, in many cases, I just don't put anything in here. Okay. We talked about, various duties. So we have, if we go back up to 5 and 6, in section 5, we've got what are called uniform duties, right? And then in section 6, we have those additional duties of a seller's agent. And then if we add other stuff elsewhere in the contract, typically it would be either here or down in additional provisions in this contract, right here, then those could create additional duties that would allow our seller to terminate if we violate one of those duties. Okay, and so real quick, we'll talk about this while we're down here. All right, the seller may have a right to unilaterally cancel this contract, which normally they don't. It's not a unilateral contract, right? It is a bilateral contract, meaning both parties have to have, any changes agreed to in writing, including canceling this contract, right? But in some cases, the seller may have a unilateral right to cancel. One would be if we abandon the seller. Well, abandonment is not defined in this contract. So how do you prove that your seller has not been abandoned? Well, I keep record of, your communications, when you talk to them, what those conversations were about, how often are you sending out updates and reminders and showing feedback and everything else, right? 2 is if you fail to fulfill all of your material obligations, okay? And that's what we're talking about, is those material obligations may come from that 9.3.1 or the additional provision section of the contract, right? Or failure to fulfill any of those uniform duties that we talked about in section 5, or the agency duties in section 6, if that box is checked at the top of our contract, okay? So be careful about what you're writing in here. You might start writing stuff about open houses. Well, then what happens if open houses get canceled because of, some spike in COVID cases and deaths and whatever else, and all of a sudden things get tightened back down and now we can't do open houses? Well, have you theoretically violated one of your material obligations to your seller? Potentially you could. Will that hold up in court? I doubt it. If there's a if there's a mandate coming down from the state that you can't do an open house, then I don't think that's going to hold up in court. But if you say you're going to do open houses every weekend and then you're out of town and you can't get coverage for an open house, like, then that's potentially you violating your material obligations to your seller. Okay.
So Jesse, I hear you saying the best is just to leave it blank.
The best, you can make that argument. I mean, it provides the most protection for you as the broker if you leave this blank, right? But in many cases, you're just going to have sellers who want a detailed account of, hey, what is it that you're going to do to market my property? And in order to get the listing, you may just have to write it in there, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It just means if you don't do one of those things, that the seller may have a unilateral right to terminate. So do whatever it is that you say you're going to do, which we should be doing anyway, right? But yeah, I mean, typically, again, if it's somebody that I have a good relationship with, or family or something like that, I just don't bother putting anything in here, right? I talk about it, at my listing appointment with them. Hey, here's what I'm going to do for you. And then it's just we have a mutual agreement. That I'm going to do those things, and I actually do those things, right? And there's a level of trust there. But if if you and or the seller want it to be something that is contractually agreed upon, nothing wrong with putting it in here either. Okay. Seller authorizes videos and pictures of the interior and exterior of the property, except, right? So they may have a particular room or, a reason why they may not want you to photograph a particular area of the property. If they have a vault that has, valuable artwork, or, maybe they've got a gun range in their property and they don't want people to, see the pictures of it, or, whatever it is, right? There may be some reasons why they don't want either the interior or exterior, or maybe just a particular room to be photographed or videoed or whatever, right? In most cases, you're not going to run into that. So again, in most cases, you can just leave this blank, but if for some reason there is something, then go ahead and write it in there. So this is the one I was talking about as far as removing those marketing videos or photos or whatever, right? So broker and brokerage firm may discontinue using any marketing materials if the brokerage firm receives a credible threat of litigation, right? And so some people are like, hey, you have to take those down, or it's a violation of my privacy, or, whatever. Like drone photos are a perfect example, right? You get some drone photography of a neighbor's property and they're like, hey, take it down or I'm going to sue you. All right. Whether that lawsuit is valid or not, in many cases, it's just not worth fighting, and it's not worth throwing money at for a legal purpose. So it's probably best to just remove it. In other cases, there are some, legitimate privacy concerns or whatever that may require you to take something down, a video or a photo or whatever. However, upon expiration of the listing period, potentially requested from the seller, you're going to use reasonable efforts to remove those if you're requested to remove them. But the seller understands that in some cases, it's impossible to do that, right? Once your info is out there on the internet, right? Like, people have access to it. It's difficult to remove. And so, just little soapbox caveat, right? That's true for anything in addition to marketing somebody's property. This is true for your comments on social media and all these other things, right? If you put it out there on the internet, it's out there forever. No matter how hard you try to scrub, somebody probably has a screenshot of it, right? There's a cached version somewhere. So just be careful of what you're putting out there on the internet. But that being said, it's probably impossible to remove all of the marketing materials from every website possible. And the seller's releasing us from liability by signing our contract for our inability to remove that info. Okay. Let's see, seller's obligations. So negotiations and communications, seller agrees to conduct those negotiations for the sale of the property through you. I've got a really weird deal right now. It actually closes at noon today. And the seller, I'm working with the seller, another broker is working with the buyer. And, I get this call from the buyer's broker and she's like, hey, are you aware that like the buyer and seller are communicating with each other? I'm like, I didn't even know that they had each other's contact info. Well, it turns out the buyer looked up the seller's company. He's a fabricator. And so looked up the seller's company, right? And has his phone number because he wants his business to be found, obviously. And so they call him up and they start talking, right? And they start agreeing to things outside of our contract. And so I called my guy and I'm like, hey, dude, like, it's really best if you conduct any communications through us as the brokers. He's like, oh, yeah, okay, no big deal. I'm like, this is a rural deal. This is out in none. And, they operate on the old school handshake principle, right? Not so much on the contract principle. And so anyway, I'm like texting him last night, like, hey, you guys all ready for closing? You guys all moved out? Like, everything gonna be ready? He's like, I don't know, we still have 15 hours, right? And I'm like, well, how much stuff do you have left, dude? He's like, well, the house is empty, but the shop still has a ton of stuff in it. And like, his shop has all of his fabrication equipment. Like, this is stuff that you don't just move overnight, right? This is not easy to do. You got to have machinery and all this other stuff. I'm like, well, is it going to be out by closing? He's like, oh no, I'm not worried about it. And I'm like, dude, we have to turn over possession of the property at closing. And so then he sends me a picture. They have storage containers on the property. So he sends me a picture of the storage container opened up with, and all of the buyer's stuff is already inside the storage container. And I'm like, whoa, what happened? Right. And he's like, oh, no big deal. Like, we've got it all worked out. Like, I let him move his stuff into the property like last week. And in the meantime, like, he knows that I'm going to have some stuff left at the shop that it just isn't going to be gone by closing. I was like, are you serious, dude? And so, hopefully there's no issues, right? But it could create a serious problem for buyers and sellers who are agreeing to stuff outside of the contract. I mean, now what happens if this buyer fails to close at noon today and he's got stuff on the property? Well, he's effectively just become a tenant, and now we may have rights as a tenant. Well, tenants' rights right now are crazy with COVID. So, I mean, he's put himself in a real bad spot. I mean, again, probably there's not going to be any issues because they're just back, they're rural folk that are operating on this handshake principle, and like, they don't care, they let the guy move in early and they're going to move out a little bit late. I'm like, this is just crazy to me because of the world that we live in, right? But it does happen. So advise your clients against talking to each other. Although it may seem friendly, it can certainly create issues down the road. Okay. As far as advertising, seller agrees in any advertising the property that the seller is going to do needs to first be approved by you as the broker. Maybe not as big of a deal in this crazy hot market that we're in, but, particularly if our market shifts a little bit, right? And the seller's blasting out all this stuff and they start talking about their motivations and, everything else, right? That's not something that we as trained, licensed brokers are going to do, is talk about our sellers' motivations, but they're not trained in that, right? And so they might start barfing up all of their motivations and their circumstances and everything else, right? And then, savvy buyers, brokers, or buyers, they're like stalking the seller on Facebook or Insta or whatever, right? And they're like, oh yeah, like, we know what the seller situation is. Let's take advantage of them. So be careful about what your sellers are putting out there, right? Not a bad idea to have them blast out their own listing, right, to their own sphere, help market the property. They might know somebody who wants to buy the house too, and that's all fine and good, but just make sure that there's nothing in that advertising that's done by the seller that is going to put the seller in a bad spot. Okay. 10.3 is definitely important. So it talks about the fact that the seller hopefully is not currently a party to any other listing agreement with another broker. If they call you up and they say, hey, Jerry, like, yes, I already have a contract with another broker to sell the property, but we don't like our broker and we don't feel like they're doing a good job, and we would really like to list our property with you. Well, what the heck do you do? And I'm not just asking Jerry, anyone can answer. They say, yeah, we're listed with somebody else, but
Get
they
advice
suck.
from an attorney.
Well, so certainly that's not a bad idea, right? Get advice from an attorney. What else could we do?
You could write up an exclusive that begins the day that one expires.
Yep. So, that's probably the best, easiest, cheapest thing to do is say, hey, when does your other listing expire, right? I can't list the property while you're currently under contract to sell the property with someone else, right? But I can certainly take a listing that becomes effective upon the expiration of your other listing. So then the problem comes up with them saying, well, I don't know, can you take a look at my listing contract and tell me when my listing's expired? The answer is no. I don't ever want to have a listing contract from another broker, regardless of how good your intentions are, right? You're just trying to, help your client figure out when their listing expires or whatever. Okay, if you have somebody else's listing contract, the only reason for you to have that is so that you can provide advice to someone on that contract. Well, you have the authority to interpret standard forms, right? And their exclusive right to sell is probably a standard form if it was written on the Colorado Real Estate, Commission's exclusive right to sell. However, that authority ends with contracts that are actually written by you as an individual. You have no authority to interpret a contract that was written by another broker or another brokerage firm. So be careful, not a good idea to ever even have it in your email. I don't want them to send it to me. I don't want them to show it to me, right? Because I have no authority to interpret that for them. They need to be comfortable with, hey, my other listing, contract has expired or it will expire on this date, right? They need to tell you when that happens. If they don't know, or if they can't figure it out for themselves, then they either need to go talk to the broker who they have the contract with, or they need to go talk to an attorney and get that advice.
Yeah,
Okay?
we Jesse, we talked about that today in scripts. And
Yeah.
the question was, can we ask them when their expiration date is? And we sort of got into this, well, it's probably not smart to do that because then you're using that for an advantage. The best thing to do is say, well, you need to check your contract and find out when that date is. And then they can let you know that, right?
Well, so a couple things. One is if they contact you and they
Right.
want to talk about it, then eventually it's going to come up as to when the listing contract expires. Because if they want to list with you, you have to say, okay, well, when does it expire, right?
Okay, so
That's
you can't
okay.
ask that.
Tactfully, yes. I mean, you got to
Okay,
be
that's
careful.
what-
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
if your buddy comes to you and says, Harry, man, I really forgot that you were in real estate. And if I would have remembered, man, I would have listed with you. Right. Well, you can't, then going out and say, well, hey, tell you what, when does your listing contract expire?
right, okay.
That they weren't coming to you to talk about listing with you, right? They kind of were offering up an apology. And I would be super careful about that because you don't want to go down the road of making it look like you're interfering with someone else's contract. But if they're coming to you saying, Harry, we don't like our broker, they're really not doing anything for us, we want to get out of our contract, right? First of all, never, ever, ever advise someone to get out of a contract with their current broker. Never advise them how to do that. That is absolutely tortious interference of a contract, and you will get popped for that. But if they can figure it all out on their own, then great. We can certainly take a listing upon the expiration. And so we almost have to have that conversation, but be careful about how you do it, right? And you shouldn't ever just be contacting someone who is currently listed that is currently listed, and you contact them and go, hey, I see your house is listed. When does it expire? It's been on the market for a long time. Then the answer to that is no, you absolutely cannot ask that question unless they come to you and ask. Okay. Jesse,
can we tell them if they say they don't know, can we say, look at section 3.7 or no? We can't say that.
Sorry, say that again. I was reading a chat, which I'll get to your question here, Ryan. I'm not quite done reading it. Ryan wrote me a book. So what was the question?
So when your sellers are saying that they're disgruntled with their agent and they don't know when their listing expires with them, can we say, look at 3.7, or we can't say that either?
I wouldn't say that either, because the problem is what happens if they wrote something into additional provisions, right? Or what happens if they've got, some other provision in the contract, some holdover clause that was modified from the text of the contract. What if they didn't write it on the Colorado Real Estate Commission's version of the contract? Then you go tell them to go to 3.7, and 3.7 in their contract says nothing about it because it's not the Colorado Real Estate Commission's version, right? So again, I hands off if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm out, right?
Thanks.
So Ryan says, unlicensed assistants using showing times. I've got an investor friend who likes to look at properties. He suggested I let him know my MLS credentials so he could search the properties. I said no, because I was worried that I would be overly exposed. But he isn't that much different than an unlicensed assistant using showing time. If he did find a property like, presumably I would help him buy it. So that could be benefit to me here is this legal ethical gray area. So if it's not truly someone who's a licensed assistant, then I wouldn't do it, right? Like you can't just say, hey, I've got a buyer who wants to see the property and I can't make it. And so I'm going to call my buyer an unlicensed assistant for the purposes of this transaction so that he can just access the property. That's, I'd say that's not even gray area. Like that's probably over the line. If it's someone who is actively involved in your business, who is actually, you pay them, you work with them, in a business setting, a real estate business setting, and they're an actual assistant for you and they just happen to be unlicensed, then totally okay, as long as you're disclosing that. But just saying, hey, I have a buyer that wants to see the property who's not licensed, I'm going to call him a licensed assistant, just not a good area to be in, I guess. That makes sense, Ryan?
He just wants to use my MLS credentials to look at properties that he wants to see, not actually go to them.
Oh, not go to them. Well, so I mean, you got to be a little bit careful. The MLS rules, which are completely separate from license law and realtor code of ethics stuff. MLS rules prevent us from sharing our MLS credentials with anyone other than ourselves. So nobody should really have access to it. Certainly what I've done in the past is just tell people, hey, particularly for Iris, right? Call a Property is Iris's public facing, consumer website. And so I'll tell them to go to Call a Property, where they can find anything. And it's usually updated within 15 minutes of putting it in the MLS. Now, obviously there's features associated with the MLS, like, my site, if you guys have used my site, which is the same as like an auto search for RE Colorado. Call Property may not have as much criteria for you to really narrow down and focus that search to set up that type of stuff. So I understand the benefit of doing that. However, if you're going to if your client wants you to set up an automated search through the MLS, I would just set it up as an automated search through the MLS, which, if they want to just see everything that pops up, you could literally just send them every single listing that ever hits the MLS. Obviously, they're going to get bombarded with emails and, listings and stuff, but to take the time to sit down to a buyer's consult with them and say, hey, what is it that you want me to set up? I can set it up to where it's just auto feeding you everything. Or if you're not interested in everything, maybe it's just everything in Boulder County, right? Okay, you can do literally everything in Boulder County and just send it to them. So I wouldn't share your MLS credentials just because that's a violation of MLS rules and you can get fined by the MLS. So
That's a great answer, Jesse. And you also pointed out a resource that I hadn't thought about, which is Call Property.
yeah, Call Property is Iris's public facing website. And if you guys haven't looked at my site, for those of you guys who are Iris subscribers, my site is just our auto search function where we can say, hey, if there's a property that hits the market for, under 600,000 in this neighborhood or this county, or you can literally like draw custom shapes, right? It doesn't have to be a neighborhood. It doesn't have to be a city or a zip code. You could literally go like, I want this street to this street to this street, right? You can make circles, however you want to do it and set it up. RE Colorado has the same functions as well. So better, in my opinion, to just take the time to do a quick little buyer consult with them and say, hey, let's get you an auto search set up. And that's going to be just as effective as, them using the MLS. And then they don't have your credentials, because then what happens if they're like playing around and they go in and they accidentally change one of your listings or, whatever, that's just, it gets all bad. So not a great idea to share MLS credentials.
Totally. They could write contracts, couldn't they?
They absolutely, they could, with your name on it. So, okay. Okay. So in most cases, right, that box is going to be checked that they are not currently a party to another listing agreement. And then they further represent that they have or have not received a list of submitted prospects. So submitted prospects come from this holdover clause that we talked about. I can't even remember where it's at. Right here. So 7.2.3, this is where your holdover clause is at. And so if they were previously listed with another broker and there is a holdover period, let's say it's 60 days, right? And the former broker properly submits a list of submitted prospects to the seller, right? And they give them their name and someone with whom they've negotiated. They do it in writing prior to the listing period expiring. And the box is checked that says, yes, the seller will still owe that holdover commission, right? And they provide you with that list, right? Again, I'm not looking at their contract. I'm not asking to see their list, right? They need to provide those names to you. And if they provide those names to you, then probably what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go down to additional provisions and say, hey, if any of these submitted prospects happen to purchase a property, then my duties are going to be temporarily suspended while that transaction takes place. I'm not going to have any brokerage duties to you. You're not going to owe any commission to me. You're going to have to figure that out with your prior broker, right? But for those individuals, my brokerage duties are going to temporarily cease unless and until that deal falls apart, at which point my brokerage duties resume, right? So that's how you handle the submitted prospects, okay? And this is something you're probably very rarely ever going to come up against. I mean, especially in this market, again, if our market shifts to a buyer's market and stuff sits on the market for a long time and listings start expiring, right? Instead of going under contract in 2 hours, that might become a real thing. But in this market, you're just not going to see a lot of these submitted prospects. The one maybe area that you see it is for like real high-end custom properties where, maybe they had an offer, right? If it was listed at 2 million, you get an offer at 1.6 and seller comes down to 1.8, right? They're still way far apart, but there's a possibility that, that buyer might come back after the listing expires and says, hey, let's try to put this deal back together, right? If it happens during that holdover period, they could potentially be a submitted prospect, okay? So not something we see a lot right now, but that's what it is, okay? Ownership of materials and consent. So if the seller is going to provide you with materials, photographs, videos, images, floor plans, whatever, then effectively what they're saying is, hey, I as a seller have a right to use these, provide these to you, and I'm giving you authorized access to provide them to the MLS, right? And it's non-exclusive, irrevocable, royalty-free license to use all that information, okay? They also are agreeing that any materials that you provide, so if you pay for your professional photos, you get professional floor plans from Appraisal Dimensions or whatever, you have some drone photography, some videos, whatever it is, the seller is not allowed to use those for any reason. And typically where we might see this pop up is if a listing expires, one of your listings expire and the seller's like, hey, Ryan had amazing photography. It was beautiful. He just sucked at marketing. I'm not picking on Ryan. I'm just saying, he sucked at marketing the property though. So we'd really love to reuse those photographs and have someone who knows what they're doing for marketing, right? And then they go and basically steal those photographs or floor plans or whatever it is. Well, they're not allowed to do that. Okay. They cannot use that without your written permission. And you may not have the ability to give them permission to do that without permission from the photographer or videographer or whoever did the work in the first place. Okay, so be careful about all that stuff. Colorado Foreclosure Protection Act. So in most cases, this is just not going to apply, particularly because there's not a lot of properties that are in foreclosure. Yes, with the pandemic, those have gone up a little bit. However, right now there's still moratoriums in place. And so, it is important to know what the act is and when it applies, but all of these things have to take place in order for this act to apply. So 1, the property has to be residential. 2, the seller has to reside in the property as their principal residence. 3, the buyer's purpose in purchasing the property is not going to be to use it as their principal personal residence. So in other words, we're talking about an investor, right? So if the buyer is an investor and the property is residential and it was the seller's primary residence and the property is in foreclosure, right? Or the buyer has noticed that the loan is more than 30 days delinquent. If all of those are met, then the act applies. If it's not, then it doesn't apply, right? So it's just not something you're going to come across very often. The other piece is if it's a short sale, then that's not going to apply because we have a short sale contract that deals specifically with that. But if the Colorado Foreclosure Protection Act does apply, we actually there's a separate contract that we just never talk about because it hasn't been a thing for years in Colorado. But there is a whole separate contract that you would need to use that has some different clauses and some different rights for the seller. So it's important to know that that exists. It's important to know when we use it. Okay. Purchase price and term. So what is the price going to be, that you're going to market the property as? Loan terms, right? In most cases, you're willing to take cash, conventional. FHA has loan limits. So, you kind of need to know where those loan limits are and, figure out, does it make sense to market this for potential FHA buyers or does it not? What you don't want to do is get under contract with an FHA buyer and then have them go, hey, we can't even buy this house because FHA's loan limits don't go up that high, right? So know what FHA's loan limits are. They vary by county. So if you just Google FHA loan limits for Larimer County, Weld County, Douglas County, whatever, it'll pop up and it'll tell you, make sure you're looking at the right year because they do change from year to year. So know that VA doesn't truly have a cap. They have a cap on the 100% financing piece in most cases, but if a VA buyer goes above that 100% limit, then in many cases they just have to bring like 20 or 25% of whatever that additional amount is. And so if they want to purchase something that's $100,000 over the 100% VA financing limit, then they would have to bring 20,000 or 25 or whatever it is, right? Consult with your lender. And again, there's always changes regarding this stuff, but no true cap on VA. So doesn't hurt to market most properties as VA, but unlikely that you might see VA buyers for, $1 million plus properties, but certainly not unheard of either. Okay. 11.3 talks about loan discount points. Again, in a crazy hot market, there is no reason to market any loan discount points that the seller is willing to pay right up front in the MLS. So in most cases, that's just going to be 0, at least in this market. Same thing with 11.4. Sellers, in most cases, they're not going to just straight up offer off the top to pay, $5,000 worth of buyer's closing costs or whatever number you put in there. Okay. So that's just going to be blank for the most part right now. Earnest money. Earnest money is typically about 1% of the purchase price. However, there is no hard and fast rule that says it has to be. I've done deals with $0 in earnest money. I would never advise a seller to take a $0 earnest money deal. But I've had buyers before who were VA buyers with 0 earnest money, and we were able to put that property under contract. If a broker really knows what they're doing, then there are ways to do it with 0 earnest money where the buyer is still on the hook for, a dollar amount, but the buyer doesn't actually transfer any earnest money right up front. And that's called a promissory note. So the promissory note might be where you say, hey, I've got a VA buyer. They don't have, $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever the earnest money amount is. They don't have the money to pay for the earnest money deposit up front. However, they will sign a promissory note that says, hey, if we, the buyer, violate the terms of our contract, and if we default under our contract, then we will be on the hook for whatever the amount of earnest money that it gets agreed to is, right? And so then even if the buyer defaults, then that promissory note says we are still promising to pay. Okay. But in many cases, brokers just don't know that there's a promissory note option. And they go, well, your buyer has 0 earnest money, but we aren't getting any other bites. We're not getting any other offers. We like the terms of your offer otherwise. And so, yeah, we need to get it under contract. If your buyer truly doesn't have any earnest money right now, then I guess we'll just take 0. Well, that's probably not a great move. You should explore the promissory note option if that's the case. Okay. In most cases, right, in this blank, we're gonna put the amount of the earnest money that seller is okay with. Again, typically 1%, doesn't have to be. I've seen like $50,000 earnest money on a $200,000 contract, so it can be whatever. And I say that loosely. Earnest money needs to truly be earnest money. So again, part of the Brett Lampier's issue, right, was that he was taking $100,000 earnest money on a $200,000 condo, making it completely non-refundable. And then, lo and behold, his, development company fails. And he's like, well, sorry, your $100,000 is non-refundable because you agreed for it to be non-refundable. Well, that's not really earnest money, right? That's a totally separate deal. So not a good idea to jack it way up, but it also doesn't have to just be 1%. Okay. So figure out what works for the seller if the buyer happens to default, and that's what you should use. And then in the form of, you can put good funds, you can put check or wire transfer. You could certainly put promissory note in there, although that's not something I would typically negotiate up front. Typically for me, I just put check or wire transfer. Okay. As far as the seller's proceeds, so how do they want their proceeds at closing? They can get a cashier's check, which is not always the best method just because cashier's checks can take a while to clear their bank. Wire transfer is typically the best and quickest option. It's not automatic either, especially if it gets deposited after the Fed cutoff deadline, which I think is like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. Can never remember which, but if it gets deposited after that amount, that's not going to clear until the next day at least. Or a closing company's trust account check. Again, not my favorite, takes a long time to clear. What happens if a closing company goes broke? Theoretically, if it's a trust account, that money should be protected, but it's very difficult to get money out of them in many cases if that happens. So in most cases, I'm just checking the funds electronically transferred. There's also a note about wire fraud here. Wire fraud is really a bigger issue on the buyer side, but certainly the sellers don't want their proceeds to be wired to a fraudulent account either. So they need to make sure that they know their bank account and routing number, and that they didn't just go online and try to look it up and some hacker intercepted their info. Just pull it straight off of your checks. If you have paper checks, probably the best and easiest way to do it, or log into your bank, whatever, right? But make sure you have the proper bank account and make sure they're protected. FIRPTA. So FIRPTA stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. Effectively, what this does is it says, hey, if the seller is a foreign person and the title company fails to collect the taxes that may be due at closing from that foreign person, then it's very difficult for the IRS to go out and get the property taxes that were supposed to be paid, or income taxes that were supposed to be paid by that foreign person. And so they say, well, we're just going to attach it to the property instead of the person. So then your buyer could be on the hook. And typically, not always, but typically, FIRPTA is 15% of the sale price of the property. All right. And so if you're selling a $300,000 property, you're going to have $45,000 tax bill if title failed to collect the taxes that were due. Okay. So make sure if your seller is a foreign person that you're checking this box. Make sure that title is aware, make sure title's collecting that, so that the buyer is not going to get stuck holding some crazy amount of taxes after they purchase the property. Okay. People always, ask well, how the heck am I supposed to ask this question? That's discrimination. It's not discrimination. You're just doing part of your job to determine whether title needs to collect taxes for FERPTA purposes or not. And so, I had a very Asian sounding, seller with a very thick Asian type accent, right? And so I didn't know for sure. And so I just said, hey, listen, I just have to ask because it's part of the contract. Are you a foreign person for the purposes of U.S. income taxation? And if you are, I just needed to let title know so that they can collect the proper taxes, right? It's as easy as that. It's not discriminatory. You're just doing your job to figure out, do we need to notify title of this so that title knows to collect them, okay? Colorado withholding is kind of similar to FERPTA, it's just not nearly as big. So typically there's a 2% withholding for the state of Colorado if the seller is not a resident. And the way that this is worded is if they will not be a Colorado resident after closing, which in most cases, title will not collect if they were a Colorado resident during their period of ownership. But again, good idea if they're moving out of the state, talk to title and say, hey, do we need to account for Colorado withholding? Because then when you're working up your net sheet at the very beginning, then you need to have on there that 2% withholding. It says, hey, title is going to have to withhold 2% of your sales proceeds, in order to pay for the Colorado withholding. Now, they can potentially get that back if they do their taxes and, their accountant is able to figure out how to make it work to where they don't owe it. Right. But that's all above our heads. So what happens is title withholds that money. And then at the end of the year, title provides them with a form that says, hey, just so you know, we're holding on to X number of, dollars associated with the sale of your property. We're going to turn it over to the state. Right. And then whatever, plus or minus you owe or that you should receive, that will be taken into account as part of your taxes. Okay. So there's actually a form that comes from title and it goes to the seller of the property, come tax time. Okay. As far as deposits, so although it says the brokerage firm is authorized to accept them.
Real quick, Jesse,
Yeah.
Concerning that tax.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but if you go from owning though to renting, I don't think you would own that tax. It's really just if you move out of the state.
Well, again, in most cases, title is not even going to collect it if you were a Colorado resident and you moved out of state. Even though that's the way it's worded in the contract, typically title won't do that. The only time they'll typically withhold it is if the seller was not a Colorado resident during their period of ownership.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And be careful because I had a deal where I thought that the husband and the wife were both Colorado residents because they'd lived here for years, right? And I'm like, okay, I know they've lived here for a long time. Surely they're Colorado residents. And it was a divorce case where they were going to be splitting the proceeds. And there just was not a lot of proceeds. They were each going to get about $4,000 when they walked away. So total proceeds were going to be $8,000. Each of them were going to walk away with $4,000 and then, complete their divorce or whatever. And the property was a $400,000. It was like $420,000. Well, 2% of the proceeds was more than the $8,000 that they were getting. And so technically it's 2% or the full amount of the proceeds, right? Well, the husband was a Colorado resident. The wife was not a Colorado resident, even though she's lived here for like 7, 8, 9 years, right? And so title's like, oh, can I see your IDs? She pulls out her ID and it's a California ID. And title's like, we're going to have to withhold 2%, which means your full $8,000. Husband's like, I'm not selling the property if I'm not walking away with my $4,000, right? And now it's like fireworks at the closing table. What the heck are we supposed to do? Husband is now refusing to sign if he doesn't walk away with his $4,000. And title saying I have to withhold the full $8,000. Like that got crazy ugly really fast. So fortunately we were able to work it out. But good idea to ask your clients if they're residents of Colorado while you're asking them if they're a foreign person as well. Okay.
So it didn't matter if one was and one wasn't then? It's just the whole 2%. It didn't.
That's correct. Yeah, because one of the sellers was not a resident.
Okay.
And yeah, the total sale, it's not per person, it's the total sales proceeds of the property, right? Was only $8,000. And title's like, well, we're gonna have to collect it all. So that was all bad. We were able to figure out a way around it, which I'm not gonna go into, but we were able to figure it out and get it closed, and we got it to work out. Okay. So deposits, even though we are authorized to accept earnest money deposits, our brokerage firms are not going to hold earnest money deposits. So use your favorite title company, go work with them, have them hold the deposit. We're authorized to deliver earnest money to the closing agent. Again, that's only if we're holding earnest money, then we would withdraw that and deliver it to closing, but we don't do that. So nothing really you need to worry about there. As far as inclusions and exclusions, so again, there's a myth in Colorado because again, we have when you take the real estate exam, there's a Colorado portion and there's a national portion, right? And they kind of have different concepts, legal concepts that you need to know. And some of it is conflicting, and inclusions are one of those, right? And so in Colorado, we do things a little bit differently than, you might think with respect to the rest of the nation. And so a lot of people are like, oh, well, if it's attached to the property, it's an inclusion. And if it's not attached to the property, then it's not included. Well, that's not the case. 13.1.1 talks about inclusions that are attached. 13.1.2 talks about inclusions that are not attached, right? And then you can come in and you can write in here exclusions that may be attached to the property as well. So good idea for you guys to know and understand what what the contract calls for as a standard inclusion. I'm not going to read it all, but lighting, heating, plumbing, HVAC, all those other things, those are all things that make sense to most people, right? Probably the important part here is if you check any of these boxes, what you're saying is they're owned by the seller and they are included in the sale of the property. Well, if it's a leased solar panels, for instance, if the solar panels are leased, then we are not checking this box here because this only indicates owned solar panels, right? Now, it is possible to own the solar panels and finance those solar panels, okay? In which case you've got to figure out, hey, seller, are you able to, assign that loan to a prospective buyer? And if you're not able to assign that loan to a prospective buyer, then you're probably going to have to pay them off. But if you are able to assign that loan to a buyer who is willing to assume that loan, then you may be able to work that into the deal, right? So you got to know if they're owned or if they're leased, and then you have to know if they are owned, do you have payments on them or do you own them outright, like you've already paid for them? That is important, okay? Water softeners, we see much less, but potentially, if it's on a well or someone just decided they want a water softener, right? Those systems can get expensive. I've seen some that are like $20,000 or more. So many people lease the water softener system. Security system, same thing, right? And then 13.1.2 talks about inclusions which are not necessarily attached to the property. So storm windows, storm doors, I'll let you guys read them. Probably the big one is window coverings and treatments, curtain rods, right? Those always come up like, hey, do I get to take the curtains with me? It's like, I don't get why people get attached to their curtains, but that is a thing that comes up inevitably. If you don't talk about it, then your seller is just going to want to keep them, and lo and behold, their contract says no, you have to give them away. I've had sellers try to swap them out for different curtains, right? And then the buyers are like, hey, these aren't the curtains that were in the pictures. It's like, oh my gosh, are we going to fight over freaking curtains today? Like it just boggles my mind when this always comes up, right? So make sure your sellers know window coverings are included unless you exclude them. And really this contract is not the important place to figure out what your inclusions and exclusions are. This is just how you're going to market the property, right? The contract to buy and sell is where it is important to note if the seller wants to exclude something, whether it's window coverings or anything else here or anything else here, right? If they want to exclude something, then it needs to be in the contract to buy and sell that it's excluded. Now, what you don't need to put in the exclusions piece is you do not need to put the seller's personal property, right? Our contract is for real property unless otherwise designated by one of these particular things that may be considered personal property, but is a standard inclusion per our contract, right? If it's not one of these things and it's personal property, our contract is for real property and you do not need to put that in there, okay? There are some, if you are working with a buyer, there are some listing brokers who just absolutely, you know, believe that you have to put the seller's personal property listed as an exclusion in your contract to buy and sell. And if that's the case, in order to get your offer accepted, rather than put the seller's personal property, I might just put the seller's personal belongings, because personal property is defined in our contract. Okay. And if you read this section, what it says is that any personal property that we're talking about here, right, in these inclusions, whether it's you know, real property or personal property, doesn't matter. We're saying if any of those things are to be considered personal property, but they're included per the terms of our contract, those things have to be conveyed by the seller free and clear of any taxes, liens, and encumbrances. And so then if you go into exclusions and you say, well, the seller's personal property is going to be excluded, effectively what you've said is, well, any of those things that maybe were agreed to may now be excluded by the seller. Well, which is it? Is it included per these sections, right? Or is it excluded per this section? So you're just creating some potentially gray area. It doesn't very often come up, but it could. So best practice is don't put anything in there. If you're working with a buyer and the listing broker doesn't understand that concept, then put seller's personal belongings in there. And good enough. It's not needed, but I understand there's a lot of brokers who just don't get that. Okay. Any other inclusions? So, you know, if there's something that would typically be considered personal property, or, you know, you're not sure whether it's a fixture or personal property, you can write those in here, right? Shelving is, you know, one of the big things that, you know, people, you know, it's like, is it included or is it not? Well, you could just go read your contract, but shelving is one thing you'd put in here. A lot of times you'll have like pool tables, hot tubs, right? The things that are difficult to move that most sellers just want to leave behind that are not addressed up here. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Safe. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did move my safe and it just about killed the guy that was helping us. So not fun, not something I look forward to, but yeah, good example.
You know, Jesse, some people put in here, they'll put the shed, even though it's up on top in the 2 point whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like redundant, right?
Yeah, you don't need to put storage shed. So, you know, and again, keep in mind, we're looking at the exclusive right to sell, right? And we're kind of talking about really the contract to buy and sell. So contract to buy and sell just has very similar verbiage.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but yeah, the storage shed is automatically included per 13.1.2, right? It's a different section in the contract to buy and sell, but you know, it's included just per the plain text of our contract. You don't need to go write it into the contract to buy and sell, you know, unless the seller wants to exclude it. I don't know, you guys probably have some people who haven't heard the chicken coop story, and I'm getting bored of listening to myself. So let's pull it up and we'll talk about it. So give me a second here. Oops, I should have had this pulled up. Hold on, where'd I go? Right here. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. So this was a a real thing that came up while I was the employing broker in Fort Collins. Let me share this. So this particular property, this greenhouse right here, this was listed by one of my brokers at the Fort Collins office. And before it was entered into the MLS, another one of my brokers at the Fort Collins office ended up bringing a buyer and putting the deal together. And so They get under contract, they get, a week away from closing, and the seller's like, hey, do the buyers want the chickens, right? This is a chicken coop. So like, does the buyer want the chickens? And so buyer's broker reaches out to the buyer, and the buyer says, no, we don't want the chickens. Okay. So in the seller's mind, the seller hears, okay, well, if they don't want the chickens, then they don't want the coop. So seller comes over here to their next door neighbor's house. Next door neighbor's house. And seller walks over, hey, our buyers don't want the chickens. Do you guys want them? They're like, yeah, we'd love to have them. And they're like, okay, great. We'll bring the coop over. Right. And although the coop is relatively sizable, it's very lightweight. I mean, like 4 guys, one on each corner, picked it up and, popped it over the fence and walked it over here. And they set it right here where this basketball hoop is. So there was a chicken coop that matches the painting on this house sitting in the driveway of this off to the side of this property. Right. And so buyers show up to do their final walkthrough, and they're like, hey, what the heck? The chicken coop is gone. And so they're like, well, we want the chicken coop. We just didn't want the chickens. So now there's this fight, right? And it's like, okay, well, let me go see if we can get it back from the neighbors. And the neighbors are like, hey, we've already invested a ton of money. We've bought all these supplies. We bought this, that, and the other thing. Like, no, we're not just going to give you the chicken coop back along with the chickens, right? And so now the seller can't get the coop back with the chickens. And it's like, well, what the heck are we supposed to do? And so they call me and they're like, hey, Jesse, here's a good problem for you. Help us figure it out, right? So I have to go and rely on the text in the contract, right? And I'm like, okay, well, chicken coop is not really listed anywhere in the inclusions. It's not listed in the exclusions. Is it included? Is it excluded? It's not really attached to the property, right? Which doesn't really matter, but it's certainly a method of determining whether something should be attached or not. Yes, it's a fairly sizable structure. Yes, it is very portable. What the heck am I supposed to do? Right. And so, if we just go back and we look in the contract, so, these are inclusions that are attached to the property, right? Then we've got inclusions that are not attached to the property. There is no chicken coop in there anywhere. There is storage sheds, right? And so I'm talking to the buyers and I'm like, hey, like chicken coop is just not addressed as an inclusion or an exclusion in our contract. And here's the verbiage that talks about what is included, right? And so then the buyer's like, well, I think your interpretation is wrong. It's a storage shed. It's just a storage shed for chickens. And so, I believe that it should be included under the storage shed, right? And I'm like, well, there's a storage shed right here, right? And that storage shed, yes, absolutely 100% is included in the purchase price. And that is absolutely a storage shed. I don't think anyone would look at this and go, it's a storage shed, right? I mean, maybe someone would. I think this guy was just trying to make his case. And so at the end of the day, I said, you know what? Like, they can't get it back. They've already given it away. The neighbors have already spent money to, get whatever supplies they needed and everything else. So, there was this big dirt spot right here. And it was like, okay, seller, you need to remedy whatever, the ground looks like, continue the grass out that way or whatever. But my opinion is it's not included because it's not included in the text of our contract, right? And I get people who disagree with me all the time, and that's perfectly okay, right? And it just goes to show, like, our contract isn't perfect. It doesn't address everything. So how could we have remedied this from day one if the buyers wanted the chicken coop? How could we have effectively dealt with that? Well, write it down here in 13.1.4 that the chicken coop would be included, right? So didn't happen.
But Jesse, isn't that if the sellers wanted to get rid of it, right?
Well, if the sellers wanted to get rid of it, then they would list it down here in exclusions, right? if the buyers wanted it, then
Right,
again,
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Right.
yeah, and again, we're not talking about the contract to buy and sell, but the
Sorry.
contract to buy and sell has
Yeah, I keep getting
similar,
that.
right?
Yeah, right.
So, yep. But if the seller wanted to exclude it, meaning the seller wanted to take it or gift it to someone else, then they need to list it in exclusions. Okay.
Hey, Jesse,
Yep. Go ahead.
if push came to shove on this one and you couldn't get it resolved, go out and spend a couple of $100 on some lumber and build one.
Yeah, and I think what ended up happening was buyer's agent kicked in some of her commission, like not a lot, but $250 or something
Yeah.
to because yeah, I mean it's not like this was the Taj Mahal of chicken coops, It
That's
just
what I was thinking.
it's not bad and it's a good sized chicken coop, but it wasn't like a $20,000 chicken coop either,
No.
right? Like go buy some wood, some chicken wire, some corrugated tin or whatever for the roof, like that's what it is, right? And so buyer's broker was like, well, I screwed up because I didn't put it in the inclusions that the buyer wanted it. It's not listed as an inclusion in the contract. So I think she kicked in like $250 or something to make it work.
Okay.
So, but it's a good learning piece, right? I mean, same thing with lean-tos and loafing sheds and whatever. Like if you've got some other structures on the property that aren't mentioned in the inclusions, like write it into your contract. If it's important for the buyer, then write it in, because if it's not written into the contract, I don't know what to tell you. Okay. Leased items. So this would be those solar panels, security system, all that other stuff, right? That you would list whatever is being leased right here. Seller needs to provide those lease documents to the buyer, make sure that the buyer's okay with that. We talked about exclusions. Trade fixtures, really, this is more for business. So, Ryan's working in the bike shop. I'm not a bike person, but whatever, if Ryan was selling the bike shop, maybe there's some, trade fixtures that would be included in the sale, particularly if, the buyer was interested in continuing to operate it as a bike shop. And if you guys have biking needs, go check out Ryan's bike shop. Ryan, you want to give us a little plug here? No, he's muted. I don't know what his bike shop's called. I have his card somewhere, but yeah, if you guys have any bike needs, go hit him up. So let's see. Parking and storage facilities. Oh, go ahead.
So Jesse, just for my own sake, let's say in other inclusions, you put that you wanted to, that in the sale of the house, you wanted to get rid of that shed, right?
Well, they'd go in exclusions in the contract to buy and sell.
I'm sorry. I'm talking, but I want to list those things. So if I'm working with my seller under inclusions, and I don't want the shed, and I want to sell the shed as part of my house, right?
Well, if the seller wants to sell the shed, you don't need to write anything in because it's already listed.
Okay, so you don't need to write it in. What if it's
Correct.
but if it's the chicken coop, you would suggest, because it's different, to do that.
Yeah, so if the seller wants to leave the chicken coop, then yeah, again, not super important in this contract, but contract to buy and sell, yes, that should be listed under the other inclusions, just so that there's very clearly no mistake, right? And I would say 90% of the time, the understanding is probably that the chicken coop is going to be included, and it's just going to get left regardless. But of course, the one time that you don't mention it, right, it was a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. As far as parking and storage facilities, so I typically just put any assigned per deed, right? And for most residential type properties, this is not really something you even need to put that verbiage in there. Really where it becomes more important is if there's a condo where the garages are maybe not owned, or, it's a parking space that the buyer of the condo has the right to use. Right, you might put which space it is. Same thing with storage facilities. Sometimes they have, little storage lockers for the residents or whatever. So that's what you would list here. People put like, on a standard detached house, like the attached 2-car garage or whatever. Okay, like of course that was automatically going to be included anyway. And if a seller was thinking about taking that with them, they have other problems. But I typically just put any assigned per deed. That's probably overkill, but it works. Okay. As far as water rights go, so in most cases, there's not water rights there. A water tap is not what we're talking about here. You don't need to put, you don't need to put the, water tap for the city of Fort Collins, like that's already included. We're talking about legally described water rights here, which are described with a legal description. So we're not talking about taps here, right? Other rights relating to water. If
Can
there's
that include a well?
well, so well is right down here. That's where we're getting
Okay.
to, right? So if
Okay.
there is a well, then you would check this box 13.5.3, and it's best to try to get the permit number from the seller, just because the Division of Water Resources website is not particularly user friendly. It's getting better. It used to be a huge pain in the butt, but it's gotten a little bit better. But if you have the permit number, it just makes it way easier. So try to get the permit number from the seller if the seller happens to have it. If they don't and you can't figure out how to get it, just talk to me and I'll help you out. Water stock certificate, same thing. And guys, if you're dealing with significant water rights, like, shares of a ditch company or water stock certificates or something like that, get an attorney involved. Water rights are going through the roof as far as the cost, right? And you want to make sure that you're getting what what your client thinks they're actually getting. There's senior water rights and junior water rights and all this other stuff, way above the scope of real estate brokerage. That's like, get a water attorney involved, and get some help. Okay. I had a deal, it was $1.54 million. And of that 1.54 million, $1 million of that was water just by itself, right? If you have $1 million to spend on water, you have a couple grand to go talk to a water attorney to make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting. Because it would be a shame to spend $1 million on water and not get what you thought you were getting. Okay. Same thing with growing crops, right? We're not talking about like Susie planted a garden in her backyard and she wants to come back and pick her carrots. Like, we're talking about crops, right? If you've got 40 acres or 1,000 acres worth of wheat or whatever it is, right? In some cases, you might negotiate that the seller has the right to come back and harvest those crops. And maybe you even have some kind of provision that says that the seller has the right to enter the property, to tend the crops and whatever else, right? Again, this is attorney territory. This is not something most real estate brokers should be taking on. So, be careful about that. As far as title and encumbrances, so seller represents the title of the property solely in the seller's name. Really, you should be getting an ownership and encumbrance report anytime prior to, anytime before you're listing a property. Title companies refer to them as an O&E. So get an O&E, it'll tell you who is on title to the property. Will tell you any outstanding liens and encumbrances against the property, stuff like that. So good idea to do it. Most title companies will charge you like $5. And a lot of them, if you end up closing the deal, they'll just basically waive it. Okay. So get an O&E, make sure you know the seller's names. Delivery of documents. So seller has to deliver to broker true copies of any relevant title material, material title info, such as ILCs or surveys, easements, all of that type of stuff, right? They need to be upfront with you about that. And if they have copies of those, they need to deliver those to you. Okay. Conveyance. So our contract to buy and sell has defaulted to a special warranty deed, right? We used to always ask for a general warranty deed. And in many cases, when I have a buyer, I'm still asking for the general warranty deed. However, if I have a seller, I'm typically just saying property will be transferred via special warranty deed. So again, good idea to talk to your client about the different types of deeds and, what are they comfortable with as far as transferring goes. So we'll just real quick. So a general warranty deed, right, is typically thought of as the best deed. It's basically where the seller says, hey, buyer, I'm guaranteeing to you that I have the, marketable title. And if there's ever a claim that comes up from anything from my period of ownership all the way back to the beginning of time, right? If there's ever a title claim, then I'm saying that I will defend your right to good title. Okay. A special warranty deed says, hey, buyer, I am transferring marketable title to you. I have, what I say I have. And if there's ever an issue that comes up from my period of ownership when I owned the property, I will defend your right to good title. Otherwise, it's on you, right? I'm going to skip over bargain and sale deed real quick and come back to that. Quit claim deed, right? Typically, this is just used as a correction deed. So if there was a spelling error, or if someone gets married or divorced and their name changes, right, then they could quit claim deed the property to themselves. Theoretically, I could quit claim your personal residence to you, right? Or I could even say, hey, Marie, here's a quit claim deed for Caleb's house, right? It means absolutely nothing. All it means is I am transferring to you at this time whatever ownership interest I have in Caleb's property. Well, I have 0 ownership in Caleb's property. I have no interest in, title related interest in Caleb's property. So me giving Marie a, quit claim deed for Caleb's property is valid, but it doesn't mean anything, right? And it's transferring whatever ownership interest I have in the property at this time. Okay. What a bargain and sale deed does is it says, hey, Marie, not only am I transferring to you my rights that I have in Caleb's property right now, but if I ever come into any portion of ownership of Caleb's property, it would automatically transfer to you as well. And so if I gave Marie a bargain and sale deed for Caleb's property today, right? I have no ownership interest in it today. So today it means nothing. However, if 3 years down the road, I purchase Caleb's property, then I have a title related interest and that would pass through me and directly to Marie. Okay. So a bargain and sale deed is very similar to a quit claim deed. It's just, it includes what's called after acquired title, which means if I ever come into any portion of ownership of the property, whether I own anything now or in the future, it's automatically going to pass through me to Marie, right? The other thing that they put in here, and I don't know why they put it in here, is a personal representative's deed. A personal representative's deed is a bargain and sale deed. It's just a particular type of bargain and sale deed, but it still falls under this umbrella. I think the reason that they put it in here is because brokers just didn't understand that it was a type of bargain and sale deed. So then they're freaking out, like, what the heck am I supposed to put for deed? And like they're checking the quit claim deed box, or they're checking a warranty, some kind of warranty deed, right? And so they say, okay, this is getting people in trouble. We'll just add a box for personal representative's deed, even though it's bargain and sale deed as well, right? So typically a personal representative's deed would be associated with somebody's estate. So if the seller has passed away, the estate will typically transfer what's called a personal representative's deed. And really they're making no warranties or anything that like a general or a special warranty deed would have. They're just saying, hey, we're transferring whatever title the estate has. And if for some reason the estate ever were to come into any additional portion of ownership interest in the property, it's automatically going to pass to our buyer so that we don't have to deal with it. Okay. If it's being conveyed with special or general warranty deed, then it will be conveyed subject to the statutory exceptions as defined in Colorado Revised Statute 38-30-113. Not going to get too deep into what that means, but if you're bored and you can't sleep some night, go read 38-30-113. Okay. Monetary encumbrances. So property obviously is typically going to be transferred free and clear of any taxes, except general taxes for the year of closing. That makes sense. Any monetary encumbrances must be paid at closing and released unless otherwise agreed. And so one instance where you might have something that may not be released is if there's a solar loan on the property that the buyer is going to assume, then that monetary encumbrance would, continue to exist. And you would need to have, special verbiage in your contract that says, yes, seller or buyer, you are assuming this loan, you're taking all the liability off of me as a seller, all that other stuff, right? So that's one instance where you might have a monetary encumbrance that does not get paid off at closing. There are also certain types of loans that are assumable. Okay. And so as interest rates start to creep up, which they have crept up a little bit in the past week or two, you know, a very low, you know, 2.5% interest rate loan might make the property very attractive to, you know, buyers when market rates are now adjusted to 3.5% or 4% or what, you know, however high those rates go. If you have a property with a low interest rate, you might be able to get buyers who might otherwise not qualify for the property, and they may be willing to assume the loan. Okay. Any tenancies that will be conveyed, you'll list here, right? Again, most of the properties we're going to sell are not tenant occupied, but you know, if you are selling a rental, you would list those tenancies here. Evidence title. So seller agrees to furnish to buyer, seller's expense, title commitment. We do not do abstracts for the most part in most of the areas you're going to practice. There are some places like southwestern Colorado that still use abstracts of title. But for the most part, anywhere you're practicing, we don't use abstracts. You're just going to leave that box blank. Association assessment. So good idea to get the dollar amount, you know, per month or per quarter or per year or however it's billed, right? Even though the contract to buy and sell has removed this piece, right? There's still a part in the MLS because it's still good information for a buyer to know, right? Like how much are the HOA dues? That could affect my ability to purchase a property. So make sure you're asking the seller what their current dues are. It gets a little bit weird if you're like, you know, it's like the middle of December and you're listing it and the dues are going to go up in January, right? What do you put in there? Like, you know, I think you put the dues at the time that you list the property, but you might make a note in broker's remarks that, hey, the dues are going to go from $400 a year to $500 a year starting January 1, right? But again, not crazy important because now our contract to buy and sell has removed this. And it basically just says, buyer, if you're concerned about the HOA dues, it's your job to go investigate. Okay. There's no unpaid, you know, assessments, special taxes, anything like that, other than the regular current assessments, except if there was a special assessment, you would put that here. So, you know, in many cases, it's for roof. If the roofs had to be replaced in a particular development, right? Typically, we're talking about condos, townhomes, then the association might assess a special assessment against the property, and they say, hey, every unit owner is going to have to kick in $12,000, you know, over the course of the next 6 months for the roof, right? So you could list that there if you're trying to sell and there's a special assessment, that's where that would go. Possession of the property will be delivered to buyer as follows. In most cases, I'm putting delivery of deed and funding, right? We'll transfer possession upon delivery of deed and funding. In some cases, maybe the seller needs post-closing occupancy. So write whatever works for your particular situation in there, okay? You do not need to write the tenants, you know, any leases in here because it's already subject to leases and tenancies. So don't need to write that in there, okay? As far as material defects, right? Colorado law requires us to disclose to any prospective buyers any adverse material facts of which we are actually aware, okay? That would include adverse material facts pertaining to title, the physical condition of the property, material defects, environmental hazards. So this would be like meth, lead-based paint, asbestos, mold, those types of things, right? These disclosures may include matters of structural defects. It gives you a list of some things to think about, and those should always be in writing, okay? I had one of my listings that I just put under contract. When my client purchased the property, like the day after closing, there was the builder had put a bracket up on one side of a floor joist and he put a nail through that floor joist, but didn't realize that it went through the floor joist into a piece of the PEX plumbing that was on the other side. And that held pressure all the way through the construction process. And then it was like the day after closing or 2 days after closing, it had slowly pushed that nail out. And then all of a sudden there was a leak. And while my buyer was at work, it flooded his basement and went, soaked through the floor into the crawl space, right? And so serious mitigation, right? They had to do a bunch of testing for mold and all that other stuff. And with the crazy market that we're in, we put it on the market, right? And the offer that we got, the buyers were waiving every single one of the contingency, deadlines in the contract, except for record title. So they basically were saying, as long as you have good title, I have no outs in my contract, period. Nothing for inspections, nothing for property disclosure, nothing for financing, nothing for appraisal, nothing for property insurance. Literally waived every single one of them. They were all NA or blank or deleted except title. And when the broker emailed it to me, he said, hey, buyers waiving, all of their rights, including their right to receive the property disclosure. Well, guess what? The seller and you as the broker, if you know that, you still have an obligation to present in writing any adverse material facts of which you're actually aware. And even though there's no current issues, right, that is probably something that an average person would consider to be an adverse material fact. And so what I did was I signed his contract, right? Before I disclosed this information to him, I signed his contract and I said, hey, just so you know, we appreciate the offer, the way that it was written, everything else. Here you go. We're under contract. Just so you know, the seller understands the seller's obligations to disclose adverse material facts. This is what happened. Here you go. Okay. Seller's obligation. So seller either agrees or does not agree to provide.
So, but even though you did that, it had, you fulfilled your obligation, but at the end of the day, it didn't matter.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it didn't matter, right? Because there really are no current issues. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the contract to buy and sell. But what we didn't have to do is we didn't have to provide the Colorado Real Estate Commission version of the seller's property disclosure form. Nothing says that disclosure has to be on the CREC version, right? It just has to be in writing. And so I sent it to him in an email so that way it's, always in forever there in my email. I've got proof that I disclosed this to him, right? So that way it's in writing, yet it is not on the CREC version, which if you check this box that says the seller agrees, right? And then if you go into the contract to buy and sell, right? And if they've written a deadline in for the seller's property disclosure deadline, then it does have to be on the CREC version, completed with, to the seller's current actual knowledge. So you just have to be a little bit careful, because what happens if we shift to a buyer's market where stuff is sitting for 6 months, 9 months, a year, right? And seller fills out the property disclosure day one, and then 12 months down the road, you go under contract. Well, during that 12 months, there could be some adverse material facts that have changed from what they put on the seller's property disclosure day one. So really the best practice is, if your sellers are going to do that, to do it day one, then have them revisit, right as you're going under contract, have them revisit that and make sure that there's nothing that's changed.
Okay, so here I go again.
Yeah.
So let's say you had this with your seller and you agreed to do it. Did you then just not provide it to the buyer?
Well, so for me, right, I don't even have my sellers do it day one, because in this market, right, it makes sense to just do it, but the seller has to do it per their current actual knowledge. And so why do it up front when you don't know how long it's going to take, right, to get your property under contract? So I don't even have my seller do it until we're going under contract. Well, in this case, by the time we were going under contract, we knew the buyer wasn't requesting the CREC version of the property disclosure. So we just disclosed in an email, hey, here's what we know about the property. And it's a relatively new property, but still something that should be disclosed. Okay. Lead-based paint. So even though the contract says January 1, 1978, our office policy is technically prior to 1980. So, in other words, if it was built prior to December 31st, 1979, we want to see a lead-based paint disclosure, because the text says we're talking about a building permit being issued prior to January 1, 1978, right? Theoretically, if a building permit was issued on December 31st of 1977, but the completion date doesn't show until 1978 because it took 8 months to build, right? That property should still have a lead-based paint disclosure. So our office policy says, hey, if it was effectively, if it was 1979 or before, we want a lead-based paint disclosure if we have the seller. Now, if we have the buyer, we can't force them. We can't force a seller to give us a lead-based paint disclosure. But this lead-based paint disclosure is really to is provided, right, to protect the buyer. But the reason we're concerned about it when we have the seller is that by providing it, we are limiting the seller's liability. Okay. So if we have the seller and it's 1979 or before, we want to see a lead-based paint disclosure. If we have the buyer and it's 1979 or 1978, you can ask, but chances are they're probably not going to give you one. Okay. Carbon monoxide alarms. So there's a difference between carbon monoxide alarms and smoke detectors. Smoke detectors are a code thing. Carbon monoxide alarms are a Colorado law. Okay. And Colorado law says that anytime you're selling a property or renting it, if the improvements, meaning the house, right? If the house has a fuel-fired heater, so like a gas furnace or some other fuel-fired heater, something other than electric, right? If it has a fuel-fired heater or some other gas appliance, if it has a fireplace, if it has an attached garage, and one or more rooms lawfully used for sleeping purposes, i.e. bedroom, then the seller is required to place those carbon monoxide detectors within 15 feet of the entrance to any bedroom. Okay. Condition of the property needs to be similar as to when it went under contract. Ordinary wear and tear is accepted. Unfortunately, ordinary wear and tear is not defined anywhere in our contract. So the best practice is just make it better than it was when the property went under contract, and hopefully you'll have no issues. Good idea to document any damage, right? Make sure that the buyers are aware of any damage when it went under contract, so that way they can't come back and claim, hey, you never told us that this was damaged, right? You don't want to have posters concealing like holes in the drywall and all that other stuff, right? Maybe for pictures or whatever, but let the buyers know that there's damage to the property before they go under contract, so that way there's no question about what the condition of the property is going to be at the time of closing. Okay. We talked a little bit about the rights of the seller to cancel. So we'll skip that part. You as the broker also have the right to terminate this contract. In certain cases, you do not have a unilateral right unless the seller has defaulted under the terms of this contract. So couple things, and I don't know why they list it this way. They have an enumerated list here, but the very first thing actually comes in this first sentence, says the brokerage firm can cancel the listing contract upon written notice to seller that the title is not satisfactory. So if you don't have merchantable or marketable title, then the broker or brokerage firm could cancel. And then you've also got, if the physical condition of the property or the inclusions changes or becomes unsatisfactory, right? If the property burns down, well, you really can't continue to market it for full value if the property burns down unless and until it gets fixed, right? If there's some kind of proposed or existing transportation project, road, street, or highway that, was not known beforehand, well, that could have an effect on the value as well. If there's some kind of other activity, odor, or noise, whether it is on or off the property does not matter. But if it will have an effect or some expected effect on the property or the price, right, then you can terminate. And this one's kind of interesting. If there's any facts or suspicions regarding circumstances that could psychologically impact or stigmatize the property, you as the broker can cancel as well. The reason that's interesting is because you have no right to disclose a psychologically impacted or stigmatized property. And so I think this is like, you're out for marketing if you're just not comfortable with it right up front. So it's a little bit weird that there's a different standard there, but you don't have to market a property if it is, psychologically impacted or stigmatized. Okay. Forfeiture payment. So in most cases for me, if the buyer defaults, I'm just going to pay 100% of that forfeited earnest money to the seller. There's nothing wrong with dividing it 50-50 or some other agreement, right? Broker's going to get $1,000 and, or sorry, seller, not buyer. Broker will get $1,000 and the seller will get the rest, what, 75-25, whatever your agreement is, right? It's all okay. So do what works for you. For me personally, I typically check the box that says 100%. We'll go to the seller. Okay. Cost of services and reimbursement. So unless it's been agreed to somewhere in writing, the brokerage firm will bear the cost of any marketing expenses that are incurred by you as, and not really the firm, right? We're not going to pay for your marketing costs. That's on you as the broker. So you're responsible for those marketing costs. That is not the responsibility of the seller unless you've agreed to that somewhere in your contract. Okay. The brokerage firm are not going to order any products or services unless the seller agrees in writing to pay for them. You know, you might think that's not a big deal, but we had a broker in the Fort Collins office who was marketing. They had assembled kind of like a whole block in Old Town Fort Collins that they were, you know, putting together to redevelop the whole block basically. And they got a contract, right? As part of the contract, it was like, oh, the seller agrees to do the ILC or whatever. And broker was like, okay, yeah, like I'll have my people do it and then I'll send you the invoice, right? So the broker has his surveyors come out, do an ILC on the property. This was never in writing, right? It was potentially a phone call from what we can tell, but we have no proof. So listing broker has his surveyors come out, do an ILC, and then the deal falls apart. And the broker was like, okay, well, here's the invoice for the ILC. Seller's like, I never agreed to pay for it. So dude got stuck with, you know, it was a hefty bill for an ILC because it was a whole block, right? So I don't remember what it was, but several $1,000s that this guy had to eat because his seller wouldn't pay for it. And the broker was the one that ordered it. So the surveyor has the broker's name on record, right? And so they're going to send him to collections if he doesn't pay. His seller refused to pay. So it just got ugly. Don't do it unless they agree in writing to pay for it. Disclosure of settlement costs. Obviously, there's different types of, you know, service providers, attorneys, lenders, title companies, inspectors, right? And they acknowledge that the quality and costs and you know, extent of service may be different for those people, right? Again, best property is to just give them 3 to choose from, let them choose. You know, I used to always have my one go-to title company that I would always use. And then I got burned to the tune of $17,000 because they missed something. And that's when it kind of hit me that like, hey, it's important to actually give them 3 because, you know, on that deal, my seller could have come back and said, hey, these are your people. These are the people that you recommended. This is your fault, you know. Whereas if I had recommended 3 title companies and let them pick, it's like, hey, you picked the title company, not me, right? So, you know, learn from others' mistakes, give them 3, you know, 3 names, best practice, okay?
Jesse, what do you say when you give them the 3 and they say, okay, well, out of the 3 because of the time factor, they're like, who do you recommend?
I recommend any of these 3. I've worked with them all, and they're great. Is there one that's most convenient to you?
Okay.
I don't. Yep. I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. So, but good idea to develop your script ahead of time so that you're not like, oh, yeah, Heritage is my favorite, right? So use whatever script you're going to use, but yeah, I let them decide. Maintenance of the property. This is a fun one. So neither the broker nor the brokerage firm is responsible for maintaining the property, and they're not liable for damage of any kind occurring to the property unless it is caused by their negligence or intentional misconduct. Okay. Not going to tell you the squirrel story again, but you know, a lot of you guys have heard the squirrel story. There was a property that had some squirrel damage because they got into the fireplace flue. They tried to sue the Fort Collins office because they thought that we were supposed to maintain the property. No, we're not. It says it right here. That lawsuit never went anywhere, fortunately, but yeah, don't agree to maintain the property. just not a good idea. You never know what's going to happen. Look at what happened down in Texas recently, right? With all the pipes freezing and all that other stuff. You don't want to be responsible for maintaining the property and having something like that pop up. Okay.
So Jesse, I did an open house where the listing agent had come in and turned on all the lights and the fireplace and everything else. And then there was a note that says, please turn everything off when you leave.
Yep.
So when I left, the only thing I couldn't turn off was the fireplace. It wouldn't turn off. And so I called him twice to say, hey, I can't turn off the fireplace. And then I never heard, he never called me back. So am I still obligated at that point? I mean, what's my remedy?
Put something in writing, right? A text and an email. So it's like, hey, seller, I tried to call your broker.
Okay.
And
so put it in writing.
I tried to let them know, but they're not answering their phone. They're not responding to texts. They're not responding to emails. Hopefully nothing happens, right? Obviously, if you have the seller's info, then you can contact the seller. But in your case, you probably didn't, right? If you're doing an open house or someone else.
So even though I should have texted, even though I left a message on his phone and did all that and could show that I called, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, I would put it in writing.
Fair
It's
enough.
easier to prove.
Fair enough. Yep.
Non-discrimination. Guys, don't discriminate. It lists all of your protected classes. This is going to change because there's now additional protected classes. Just don't discriminate.
So any realtor with a Green Bay Packer hat on doesn't get to.
We won't talk about Jerry in this class. Recommend legal and tax counsel for anything that's outside of the scope of your real estate brokerage duties. Mediation, you guys are probably pretty familiar. If not, the mediation clause has to be satisfied before something can move to court. It doesn't necessarily mean that they actually have to go to mediation, but the mediation clause has to be satisfied, which means the parties have to, try to appoint a mediator, try to settle on a date and time that's acceptable to the parties. If they can't do that in 30 days, it could proceed to court. If it does proceed to arbitration or litigation, then whoever wins in court could be awarded their costs, their legal fees and expenses. Regardless of how black and white this is, guys, again, it is not always 100% the case. So even if you feel like you have a great legal case against somebody, in many cases, what happens is the suit gets settled where the judge effectively decides that one party is in default, but there's always an opportunity for them to revise their suit later, right? And so effectively what often gets settled is they say, okay, we're going to accept the fact that we lost and we're not going to revise it later, but as part of that agreement, you're going to eat your own legal fees. Even though our contract says otherwise, if that's what gets settled in court, that's what gets settled, okay? Additional provisions, if you have something special regarding maybe commissions, right? What if I happen to bring a buyer, a variable rate commission? You could put that in here. I typically limit what I put in additional provisions. In most cases, there's not going to be a lot of attachments to the property. If you put your marketing plan as an attachment, you need to know that that marketing plan becomes part of your material obligation, okay? And then real quick, I know we're out of time. There's no other parties or intended beneficiaries of this. Physical delivery notice is okay. Electronic notice is okay. If there was a lawsuit between you and your seller, it would be settled by Colorado law. Any modifications of the contract need to be in writing. Counterparts means that I can sign one copy, my sellers can sign another copy, and that gets taken together. This is our entire agreement. Any other written or oral agreements have been merged into the contract, and you need to provide a copy of any contract that your client signs to your client, okay? That's all I got for today. You guys have any questions? Okay. We'll see you next Tuesday. We'll start contracted buy and sell. I think.
Jesse, are you going to do that example of how you go through yours? I'd like to.
Yeah, we can do that next week too. Remind me because I'll forget.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. See you guys. Have a good week.
Thanks, Jeff.
You bet.
Thanks, Jesse.
See ya.